The morning Louise Doyle walked into the land office in Coldwater Creek, Texas, with her dead husband's deed clutched to her chest like a shield. Every man in that room looked at her like she was already beaten, and she had not yet spoken a single word. It was the spring of 1878, and the dust of the Panhandle had not yet settled from the dry winter that had cracked the earth into a patchwork of broken promises. Coldwater Creek was a town that had grown fast and mean in the way that oil towns and cattle towns did in those years. Timber storefronts with painted signs, a hotel that smelled of tobacco and boot leather, two saloons that faced each other across Main Street like rivals at a draw. It was the kind of town where a woman alone was either pitied or preyed upon, and Louise Doyle had been both in the 6 weeks since her husband, Thomas Doyle, had died of a fever that swept through the trading post where he worked. She was 28 years old, with dark brown hair she pinned severely at the back of her neck, green eyes that people often said were too direct for a woman of her station, and hands that were rough from honest work. She was not a fragile woman. She had crossed 2 states to get to Texas with Thomas, had helped him dig post holes and string fence line, had nursed him through 3 bad winters and a bout of influenza before the fever finally took him in February. She was not the kind of woman who gave up easily, and yet standing in that land office, with the clerk looking at her like she was a child who had wandered into the wrong room, she felt something very close to despair pressing against the inside of her ribs. The deed was real. She knew it was real. Thomas had paid every cent of the $240 that the parcel of land west of town had cost him, had shaken hands with a man named Gerald Hatch who called himself a land agent, and had received the deed in return. It was written clearly, the parcel number, the acreage, the date of purchase, the signature of Gerald Hatch, the signatures of 2 witnesses whose names she did not recognize, and Thomas's own name printed in his careful, slanted handwriting. It was as real a deed as any she had ever seen. But Gerald Hatch had since sold that same parcel to a cattleman named Warren Prout, who now grazed 300 head of longhorns on the land that belonged to Louise Doyle. And when she had gone to the land office the first time, and the second time, and the third time, the clerk, a thin man named Mr. Fellows with pince-nez glasses and ink-stained fingers, had told her that Hatch's deed was irregularly filed, that the county records showed Prout's purchase as valid, and that she would need to take the matter to a circuit judge who would not arrive in Coldwater Creek for another 4 months. 4 months. She had $22 left from what Thomas had saved. She was staying in a room above the mercantile belonging to a widow named Mrs. Calloway who was kind, but could not be expected to wait 4 months for rent. And the land that was hers, the land where Thomas had planned to build a house, where he had drawn little sketches of rooms and a front porch, and a garden plot was being churned under the hooves of Warren Prout's cattle, while she argued with a clerk who would not meet her eyes. She spread the deed on the counter for the 4th time, pressing her palms flat on either side of it. "Mr. Fellows," she said, keeping her voice level with the effort of someone holding a door shut against a strong wind, "I am asking you to read this document carefully. The date of purchase is November the 14th, 1877. Please tell me the date on Mr. Prout's deed." Fellows adjusted his glasses and looked at the deed without picking it up, as if touching it might obligate him to take it seriously. "Mrs. Doyle, as I have said on several previous occasions, the matter of the date," she said. Fellows sighed. "January the 2nd, 1878. Then my husband's deed predates Mr. Prout's purchase by 7 weeks, Louise said. "Which means my husband owned that land before Gerald Hatch sold it to Mr. Prout, which means Gerald Hatch committed fraud. The matter of irregular filings. Show me the regulation," she said. "Show me in writing where it says that an irregular filing voids a prior and legitimate purchase." Fellows opened his mouth, closed it, and then did what he had done the 3 previous times she had come in. He turned and disappeared into the back room, where she could hear him shuffling papers and having a low, urgent conversation with someone she could not see. She waited. The other two men in the office, a farmer and what looked like a cattle hand, watched her from the bench along the wall with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, the way people watch someone they are certain is going to lose. She was still standing at the counter, perfectly still, when the front door of the land office opened, and the morning light came in behind a man who had to turn slightly sideways to accommodate the width of his shoulders in the doorframe. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of frame that came from years of physical labor, broad through the chest and shoulders, and tapering to a lean waist. He wore trail-worn denim trousers, a collarless shirt the color of dried wheat, and a battered brown hat that had clearly been rained on more times than could be counted. He had a face that was weathered and honest, angular without being harsh, with dark eyes that moved quickly around the room in the instinctive habit of a man accustomed to reading his surroundings. A week's worth of dark stubble traced his jaw. He was, Louise guessed, somewhere around 32 or 33, and he carried himself with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone in a room, but was quietly prepared to prove it anyway. He took off his hat as he stepped inside, which was more courtesy than most men in Coldwater Creek had shown her, and moved toward the counter. He glanced at the deed spread out in front of Louise without any particular show of interest, just a natural glance at the object on the counter in front of him. Then he stopped. He looked at it more carefully, his dark eyes traveling across the document with an attention that was different from the quick dismissal of fellows, different from the indifference of the men on the bench. His head tilted slightly, just a fraction. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, his voice low and even, with the particular cadence of a man who had spent years in open country where words carried best when spoken without excess. "Are you having trouble with that deed?" Louise looked at him. She had learned in the weeks since Thomas died to be careful about men who offered to help. Offers of help from men in Coldwater Creek generally came attached to something she was not prepared to give. But there was nothing in this man's expression that she could read as anything other than a straightforward question. His eyes were on the document, not on her in the way she had learned to dread. "I am," she said. "May I?" He gestured toward the deed, and when she nodded, he picked it up with both hands and held it up toward the light from the window, the way a man examines something he intends to judge fairly. She watched him read it. He read slowly and completely, which was itself unusual. Most men skimmed a document to find the piece they needed and discarded the rest. He read every line. She saw his eyes move down and then back up again, checking something. He turned it over and looked at the back, which bore the faded stamp of a notary in Amarillo. He set it back on the counter and smoothed it flat with one broad hand. "This looks good to me," he said. The simplicity of it, 4 words, spoken with such uncomplicated certainty, hit Louise somewhere behind her sternum. She had not realized how much she had needed someone to say exactly that until the moment he said it. "The clerk does not agree," she said. The man looked toward the back room, where Fellows was still engaged in his consultation with whoever was behind the wall. Then he looked back at the deed, at the date, at the notary stamp, at the signature line. "What's the dispute?" he asked. "The land office says Gerald Hatch filed the deed irregularly, and that Warren Pruitt's subsequent purchase supersedes my husband's prior one." She kept her voice flat because she was not going to let it shake. "My husband is dead, and I have been trying for 3 weeks to get someone in this office to acknowledge that his deed is valid." The man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is Hatch still in the county? He left in March. No one seems to know where he went." Another pause. "And Pruitt's cattle are on the land now. 300 head. He nodded slowly, as if he were organizing the facts into a structure that made sense. "What's your name, ma'am?" "Louise Doyle." "Alfred Blackwell," he said, and offered his hand. She shook it, which surprised him slightly. She could see it in the brief flicker of something that might have been respect crossing his face. His grip was firm but careful, the way a man holds something he does not want to damage. Fellows emerged from the back room at that moment, stopped when he saw Alfred at the counter, and adjusted his pince-nez glasses with the nervous energy of a man who has been caught doing something he would prefer not to explain. "Mr. Blackwell," Fellows said, and the fact that he recognized Alfred immediately told Louise something she filed away for later. "I didn't know you were back in town." "Just rode in," Alfred said. He tapped the deed on the counter with one finger. "This deed, what's the specific regulation that voids it?" Fellows blinked. "I beg your pardon. The regulation," Alfred said, patient as a man who has all day. "Mrs. Doyle tells me you've cited irregular filing as the basis for invalidating this purchase. I'd like to see the regulation in writing." "Mr. Blackwell, this is a matter for the circuit. I know when the circuit judge is coming," Alfred said. "I'm asking about the regulation." There was a long, uncomfortable silence in the land office. The two men on the bench had stopped pretending to look at other things and were watching openly now. Fellows looked from Alfred to the deed to Louise and then back to Alfred, and Louise had the distinct impression that the clerk had just run a rapid mental calculation and come up short on several important figures. "I will need to review the filing code," Fellows said at last. "Take your time," Alfred said, and set his hat on the counter and waited. Louise watched him while Fellows went back to the filing cabinets. Alfred stood with his arms crossed loosely, his weight on one boot heel, entirely at ease in the way that only men who are genuinely unafraid of a situation can be at ease. He was not performing composure. He simply had it. "Are you a lawyer, Mr. Blackwell?" she asked quietly. "No, ma'am," he said. "Trail boss mostly, but I spent a winter in Abilene working for a land attorney who paid me in room and board and legal education, and the legal education turned out to be the more valuable part." She almost smiled. Not quite. She had not quite smiled at anything in 6 weeks, but almost. Fellows returned with a heavy ledger and spent 4 minutes turning pages with increasing visible discomfort while Alfred and Louise waited in silence. What the clerk found at the end of those 4 minutes did not appear to satisfy him, judging by the way his mouth pressed into a thin line. He closed the ledger. "The filing code," Fellows said, "requires that deeds be submitted to the county recorder within 60 days of the execution of the purchase agreement." "When was the deed executed?" Alfred asked Louise. "November the 14th, she said. Alfred looked at Fellows. 60 days from November the 14th would be January the 13th. "When was the deed submitted?" A pause. "January the 9th. 4 days inside the deadline," Alfred said. Another silence. Louise could hear the clock on the wall of the office, a steady and indifferent ticking. "The matter of the notarization," Fellows began. "The notary stamp from Amarillo is on the back of the deed," Alfred said. "Dated November the 16th, 2 days after execution. That's clean as a whistle." Fellows took off his pince-nez glasses and cleaned them with the edge of his waistcoat in the way that men clean their glasses when they need a moment to think of something they know they are not going to find. He put them back on. He looked at the deed. He looked at Alfred. He looked very briefly at Louise. "I will need to consult with the county recorder," he said. "That's fine," Alfred said. "We'll wait." The county recorder was a man named Hobson who occupied a larger office at the back of the building, and when Fellows disappeared to find him, Louise let out a breath she had been holding since before she walked into the office that morning. The two men on the bench had quietly let themselves out the front door at some point during the conversation. "He's going to try to find another reason," she said. "Probably," Alfred agreed. He picked up his hat and turned it slowly in his hands, examining the brim. "But he's running out of regulations. The deed is solid, Mrs. Doyle. Your husband did everything correctly." The use of Thomas's existence, not her widow's status, not her position as a woman without a man to speak for her, but Thomas's actions, his care, his correctness made her throat tighten in a way she was not prepared for. She turned to look out the window at the street, at a wagon going past with barrels strapped to the sides, at the dust it raised that drifted and settled. "He was very careful," she said. "He read everything 3 times before he signed anything. He saved for 2 years to buy that land." She stopped herself. She did not know this man and she was not going to weep in a land office. Alfred said nothing, which was the correct response. He simply waited beside her in a way that somehow managed not to feel like pity. Hobson was a large, ruddy-faced man in his 50s who came out of the back office with the look of someone who had been interrupted at something important and was going to make it known. He shook Alfred's hand with the particular grip of a man establishing a hierarchy, nodded curtly at Louise, and picked up the deed from the counter. He read it more slowly than Fellows had, and more carefully than Louise had expected. He turned it over, he checked the date. He went to a different cabinet and pulled a different ledger, the actual recording ledger, not the filing code, and ran his finger down a column of entries until he found what he was looking for. What he found did not please him. "The prior purchase is on record," Hobson said, with the air of a man announcing an unwelcome weather forecast. "January the 9th as submitted." "Prute's cattle," Louise said. "When does he move them off my land?" Hobson looked at her, then at Alfred, and some private negotiation occurred in his expression. "That," he said carefully, "is a matter between you and Mr. Prute." "That is a matter of trespassing," Alfred said, still in the same easy, unhurried tone. "If the deed is valid and the land belongs to Mrs. Doyle, then the cattle on it are trespassing, and the damage they've done to the land since January is compensable." Hobson's jaw tightened. "Mr. Blackwell, Warren Prute is a cattle man who bought land he wasn't sold fairly," Alfred said, "which means his dispute is with Gerald Hatch, not with Mrs. Doyle." There was a long silence in which Hobson seemed to be running the same kind of calculation that Fellows had run and arriving at a similarly uncomfortable result. Finally, he set the deed down and said, in a voice that contained several things he was choosing not to say out loud, "I will issue an acknowledgment letter today confirming that Mrs. Doyle's deed is the prior recorded claim on the parcel." "Thank you," Louise said. She picked up the deed from the counter. Her hands were completely steady. She folded it carefully along its original creases and placed it back in the envelope she had been carrying it in, which was worn soft at the corners from being handled so many times. She put the envelope in the inside pocket of her coat. Then she turned to Alfred Blackwell and found him watching her with those dark, attentive eyes, and she said, "I owe you a considerable debt, Mr. Blackwell." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "The deed did the work, I just read it." "You did considerably more than read it." He shook his head slightly, but she could see the faint warmth at the corners of his mouth that he was not quite suppressing. "Do you have somewhere to be this afternoon?" She was momentarily surprised by the question. "I have to speak with Mrs. Calloway about my situation," she said, "and then I suppose I need to think about how to approach Mr. Prute." "About Prute," Alfred said. He settled his hat on his head and held the door of the land office open for her, and they stepped out together into the bright, dusty morning of Coldwater Creek. "That's going to require some care. Prute is not a man who takes being wrong graciously." Louise squinted in the sunlight. Main Street was alive with the ordinary commerce of a Texas morning. A blacksmith's hammer ringing somewhere down the block. A woman in a calico dress stepping out of the dry goods store. Horses tied at the rail in front of the hotel. The distant sound of a dog barking at something. It all looked completely normal and entirely different from how it had looked when she walked into the land office an hour ago. "I have the law on my side now," she said. "You do," Alfred agreed. "But law and a man like Prute are two different conversations, and sometimes they need a translator." He paused, then added, "I know Prute, not well but enough. Would you allow me to accompany you when you speak with him?" She looked at him sideways. The morning light caught the angles of his face, the line of his jaw, the way his eyes were serious and steady beneath the brim of his hat. She had been alone for 6 weeks in a town that did not want to help her, and she had managed, and she did not need a man to fight her battles. But this man was not offering to fight her battles. He was offering to stand beside her while she fought them herself. "Yes," she said, "I would appreciate that." They arranged to meet at the hotel at 2 o'clock, and Louise walked back to Mrs. Calloway's mercantile feeling something she had not felt since Thomas died, not happiness exactly, and not hope quite yet, but the faint predecessor of both. The particular sensation of a door that had been sealed shut beginning, very slightly, to open. Mrs. Calloway was a round, warm woman of 60 who had been widowed herself 15 years ago and had built a successful mercantile business entirely on her own initiative, a fact that gave Louise both comfort and a useful example. She was behind the counter when Louise came through the door, arranging bolts of printed cotton with the focused attention she gave to everything, and she looked up with the bright, expectant eyes of a woman who has been watching from the window. "Well," Mrs. Calloway said. "They acknowledged the deed," Louise said. Mrs. Calloway pressed both hands flat on the counter and said something sharp and satisfied under her breath that was not quite a curse but was not quite polite either. "I told you," she said. "I told you that deed was solid." "A man helped me," Louise said, and then felt herself color slightly, which was annoying. "A trail boss named Alfred Blackwell. He knew the filing code." Mrs. Calloway's expression shifted into something that Louise recognized as the particular alertness of a woman who has been hoping for something for quite a while. "Alfred Blackwell," she said. "He was through here last fall, driving a herd north for a rancher out of San Antonio. He's a good man." "He seems to be," Louise said, neutrally. "He's not married," Mrs. Calloway said, equally neutrally. "Mrs. Calloway." "I'm simply providing information," the older woman said, and went back to her bolts of cotton with an expression of complete innocence. Warren Pruitt's cattle operation was headquartered at a ranch 3 miles west of town, which was the direction Louise had never gone since arriving in Coldwater Creek, because the land beyond the 3rd-mile marker was the land that should have been hers. She and Alfred rode out to it in the early afternoon, Alfred on a steady roan gelding, and Louise on the brown mare she had been borrowing from Mrs. Calloway's stable. Pruitt met them in the yard of the ranch house, which was a large and well-built structure for the territory, a clapboard house with a real glass window on the front and a proper covered porch, the kind of house that was built by a man who expected to stay and expected people to take note of the fact. He was a heavy-set man in his mid-40s with a thick gray mustache and the permanently sun-narrowed eyes of a man who spent his life outdoors. He was not happy to see them. He was especially not happy to see the acknowledgment letter from the county recorder's office. He read the letter twice, and his mustache moved in ways that suggested significant internal weather. Then he looked at Louise and said, "I paid good money for that land." "I know you did, Mr. Pruitt," Louise said, "and I'm sorry for it, but Gerald Hatch sold you land he had already sold to my husband 7 weeks prior. The money you paid was taken from you fraudulently, and my sympathy for that is genuine, but the land is mine." 7 weeks, Pruitt said, more to himself than to her. "Your grievance is with Hatch," Alfred said, "not with Mrs. Doyle." Pruitt looked at Alfred with the look of a man who wants to dispute something and cannot find the handhold. Alfred looked back with the look of a man who has stood in the gap between other men's intentions and someone's well-being enough times to be entirely comfortable there. "I'll need time to move the cattle," Pruitt said at last. "A week is fair," Alfred said, which was the exact same number Louise had been going to name. She caught his eye briefly and saw that small warmth again at the corner of his mouth. "Fine," Pruitt said, and the word contained about 14 other words he was not saying. 1 week. He went back inside and closed his front door with sufficient force to express his feelings on the matter, while remaining technically within the bounds of civil behavior. Louise and Alfred turned their horses back toward the road. They rode for a while without speaking, which was a comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only happens between people who are not trying to fill it with something and do not feel the need to. The spring afternoon was genuinely beautiful in the way that the Texas Panhandle could be beautiful when the light hit it right, long and golden across the grass, with the sky enormous and cloudless overhead and the sound of wind moving through the dry stalks like something breathing. "What will you do with the land?" Alfred asked eventually. "Build a house," she said. "Thomas drew plans for it. A proper house with a front porch." She paused. "Eventually. First I need to get through the next few months. Have you any experience with cattle or farming? I can grow things, she said. Thomas and I kept a kitchen garden in Missouri before we came west. I know crops better than cattle. The soil out here is harder than Missouri, Alfred said, but it can grow winter wheat and sorghum if you know how to work it. And a small herd of your own wouldn't go wrong if you could get a few good animals established. He spoke about it naturally, as if her future with the land was simply a practical problem with practical solutions, not a tragedy or an impossibility, and she found that she was grateful for that too, the straightforward way he looked at her situation as something that could be managed rather than something to be mourned. You know this country well, she said. I've ridden most of it, he said. About 100 miles in every direction from here over the years. He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about stopping. She looked over at him. Stopping? Driving trail, he said. I've been at it since I was 16, working cattle up from Texas to Kansas and back again. It's a good life on the open range, but he seemed to consider how to finish the sentence. A man gets to an age where moving is just moving and it stops feeling like freedom. He was not looking at her when he said it. He was looking at the long grass moving in the wind in the far line of the horizon, but she thought she understood what was underneath the words, or at least the shape of it. How old are you, Mr. Blackwell? She asked. 34, he said. And you don't have to call me Mr. Blackwell. Alfred, then, she said, and noticed the way he turned to look at her when she said his name just briefly before looking back at the road. Louise, he said, trying it out, and it sounded different from his mouth than from anyone else's, quieter and more careful, like something he intended to keep. Over the following week, while Pruitt's cowboys moved the cattle off the parcel, Alfred stayed in Coldwater Creek. This was not, he told himself, because of Louise Doyle, but when he examined the claim in the honesty of his own mind, he found it to be only partially accurate. He did have legitimate business in town. He was waiting on payment from the rancher out of San Antonio for the last drive, and there was a supply list he was filling for a homesteader out near the canyon country who had asked him to pick up hardware and seed. But he found himself routing his days with a kind of unconscious precision that brought him past Mrs. Calloway's mercantile with a regularity that was difficult to explain purely on practical grounds. Louise was there most mornings, helping Mrs. Calloway with the stock and accounts in exchange for her room. She was quick with numbers and had a neat, decisive hand with the inventory ledger that Mrs. Calloway appreciated. Alfred came in on the second morning ostensibly for tobacco. He did not particularly need and found Louise high on a stepladder, reorganizing the upper shelves with the focused competence of someone who cannot stand disorder. And he stood below the ladder for entirely responsible reasons while she handed things down to him, and they talked about the parcel of land, and then about Missouri, and then about the railroad, and then about nothing in particular. And he realized at some point in the conversation that he had been in the store for 40 minutes and had not thought about leaving once. She was not what he had expected, which was a vague thought that he turned over carefully without being quite sure what he meant by it. He had expected someone more fragile, perhaps. A widow with a dead man's deed, and no resources might reasonably be expected to lean heavily on the help offered to her. But Louise leaned on help the way she had leaned on that counter in the land office, accepting it as a tool for the work she was already doing, not as a substitute for doing the work herself. She thanked him for what he did in specific, accurate terms, and did not inflate it into more than it was, which was more honest than most people he had known. On the third morning she brought him coffee without being asked, a tin cup of it, black and hot, placed on the counter beside him while he was looking at a map she had pulled out, a survey map of her parcel, and she sat down across the counter from him with her own cup and they bent over the map together. Here, she said, pointing. Thomas's plan had the house on this east-facing side, where the ground rises slightly. He said it would be better for drainage. He was right, Alfred said, studying the contours. And this draw here, he traced a line with his finger, the tip of it very close to but not touching her own finger on the map. That's seasonal water. You'd want your garden plot north of it, not south. She looked at where he was pointing and nodded, considering it seriously. In the morning light through the mercantile window, with her hair beginning to escape the severe pins she used and curling at her temples, she looked less like a woman holding herself together by force of will and more like a woman who was genuinely interested in water tables and garden plots, which was perhaps the same thing. "You've thought about this kind of thing a great deal," she said, looking up from the map, and found him closer than she had quite registered. They had both leaned in over the map, and the counter between them was narrow. She did not pull back. Neither did he. "Too many nights lying under the stars thinking about what you'd put where if the sky was a ceiling and not a roof," he said, and smiled a real smile, not the contained warmth she had seen at the corners of his mouth but a full one, and it changed his face in a way that did something complicated to her composure. She looked back at the map. "Alfred," she said, "are you thinking about stopping in Coldwater Creek specifically, or just stopping in general?" He was quiet for a moment. "The distinction is becoming clearer to me," he said. She looked up at him again. The morning was around them, the ordinary sounds of the street, Mrs. Calloway moving in the back room, the smell of coffee and dry goods and the faint outdoor smell of him, wind and horses and open country, and something in the air between them had changed, quietly and without announcement, from the way it had been when they first stood in the land office. "You barely know me," she said. "I know enough," he said, "to want to know more." It was an honest thing to say, and she took it honestly. "I'm not what I was before Thomas died," she said carefully, because she believed in saying difficult things plainly. "I don't know exactly what I am now. I'm still finding out." "That seems like a good reason to take time," Alfred said. "Not a bad one." She considered that. "Are you a patient man?" He picked up his coffee and looked at her over the rim of the cup with those dark, steady eyes. "I've driven cattle 600 miles at 2 miles a day," he said. "I can be patient." She laughed. It surprised her, the sound of it, the ease of it, the way it came up without her having to summon it. She had not expected to laugh for a long time yet. Alfred looked at her as if the sound was the most significant thing that had happened to him in a while, which did not help her composure in the least. The week ended and Pruett's cattle were gone from the land, and Louise rode out to see it for the first time as truly, officially, legally hers. Alfred rode with her, not because she asked him to, but because he had helped her get here, and she found she did not mind him being present for the arrival. The parcel was 200 acres of panhandle grass, rolling slightly with the contours of the land, the sky pressing down on it with that enormous Texas pressure that made everything seem both vast and intimate. There were the traces of Pruett's cattle everywhere, trampled grass, churned earth near the draw, the remains of a temporary corral they had built and then taken down. But underneath the damage the land was whole, the soil dark and present, the spring grass coming up green at the margins where the cattle had not reached. Louise stood in the middle of it with the wind moving her hair around her face and the sun on her back and looked at it for a long time. Alfred stood a little behind her and did not say anything, which was the correct thing to do. This was her land, her moment. He understood that. After a while she said, without turning around, he would have loved it. "I'm sure he would have," Alfred said quietly. "I'm going to do right by it," she said. "By what he planned for it. I'm going to build what he wanted to build here." She turned around then, and her eyes were bright but her chin was level. "For him and for me," Alfred nodded. There was nothing to add to that. They rode back to town side by side in the long afternoon light, and somewhere between the parcel and the edge of town, their horses had drifted closer together, until they were riding near enough that their boots occasionally almost touched in passing, and neither of them moved away. The building of the house took most of that summer, and it was not a solitary enterprise. Mrs. Calloway put the word out, as women in small towns have always put words out, and several of the people in Coldwater Creek who had watched Louise fight for her deed with something between admiration and guilt showed up on the first Saturday with tools and lumber, and an understanding that work was going to happen. Alfred, who had stayed in town and taken on a job managing remounts for the stage line, while he waited to see what the shape of his future was going to be, showed up before anyone else. He was a skilled hand with timber and construction, another product of those years moving through the West, learning whatever the place he was in required. And he and a farmer named Gus Patton, who had been one of the men on the bench the day of the land office conversation, and who had felt guilty about his silence every day since, formed the core of the building crew. Louise fed them, directed the interior work, and spent the evening studying Thomas's hand-drawn plans to make sure the house that was rising was the one he had designed. There were evenings, in that long, sweet Texas summer, when the building crew had gone and the day's work was done, when Alfred stayed. They would sit on the raw lumber of what would eventually be the front porch and look west at the sunset, which in the panhandle was a spectacle that never entirely seemed real. The sky going through copper and rose and violet in stages, so dramatic they seemed theatrical. They talked in the particular way that people talk when they are slowly, carefully, learning each other, not in the rushed confessions of people grabbing at connection, but in the measured, deliberate exchange of two people who have decided that something is worth taking time over. She learned that Alfred had grown up in Tennessee, the son of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died when he was 12, that he had come west at 16 with two older brothers who had both eventually settled down, one in Kansas and one in New Mexico, that he had never quite found the moment or the person that had made settling feel like arriving rather than stopping. She learned that he read unusual for a trail boss, not unheard of, and carried 3 books in his saddlebag, rotating them out whenever he found a library or a bookseller. She learned that he had a precise and somewhat unexpected sense of humor that came out sideways, in small observations that she sometimes didn't fully catch until a moment after he had said them, and then found herself laughing at something that had apparently passed by several minutes ago. He learned that she had wanted to be a school teacher and had been one briefly, for 1 year, before she married Thomas and moved with him from Missouri toward a life she had chosen with open eyes and no regrets. He learned that she was as good with a rifle as most men and better than many, a fact she mentioned with the calm, factual precision of someone reporting a useful skill rather than making a point. He learned that she cried exactly once that summer in his presence, a Tuesday evening when she found, in the last of Thomas's boxes she had not yet unpacked, a small notebook of his sketches and plans for the land, full of his careful handwriting and little drawings of the house and the garden, and that she cried quietly and briefly, and without seeking comfort from him, and he sat beside her without touching her or speaking and was simply present, which she later told him was exactly what she had needed. He also learned, on a hot July evening when the house was beginning to look like an actual house rather than a suggestion of one, that she had been watching him with the same kind of careful, sustained attention that he had been directing at her. They had been arguing about the window placement. Louise wanted the kitchen window to face east for morning light. Alfred was making the case for west, so the heat of the afternoon could help the stove in winter. And the argument was the good-natured kind that is conducted with full seriousness and equal parts genuine conviction and pleasure in the sparring. And somewhere in the middle of it, they were standing in the kitchen frame with the raw studs around them, and the evening light coming through the gap where the window would be, and she was gesturing at the angle of the light, and he was demonstrating the winter sun's trajectory with his arm outstretched, and she caught his wrist too. Redirected and then did not let go. They both went still, his wrist under her hand, her fingers around it, the evening light, the smell of raw timber and cut grass and wind. She looked up at him and he looked down at her, and there was a long moment in which neither of them moved, and then Alfred said very quietly, "Louise," just her name, the way he had said it the first time, like something kept. "I know," she said. "Do you?" "Yes," she said. "I know." He put his other hand over hers where it still held his wrist, and they stood like that in the frame of the kitchen window in the unfinished house on her land, and the sunset went through its whole impossible drama of color above the panhandle, and neither of them needed to say anything else about it. The first time he kissed her was 2 weeks later, on the completed front porch of the completed house, the house that was done, that was real, that stood where Thomas had sketched it with its east-facing front, and the garden plot north of the draw exactly where Alfred had pointed. He had walked her through every room, and she had touched the window frames and the plank floor, and the stone of the fireplace, with the reverence of someone taking possession of a thing that was both entirely new and long awaited. And on the porch in the evening, he had turned to face her, and she had turned to face him, and they had both arrived at the same moment at the same time from the same direction. He kissed her gently, and she kissed him back with conviction, and when they stepped back from each other she was not crying, and she was not confused, and she did not feel that she had been disloyal to Thomas, who had been a good man who loved her, and who had bought this land for their future, and who would, she thought with the private certainty of someone who knew a person deeply, have been entirely pleased with what was unfolding on his front porch. The summer became fall, and fall tipped toward winter, and Alfred Blackwell stopped being a man who was staying in Coldwater Creek for the stage line remount job, and became a man who was staying because Louise Doyle was there, and the land she was building was something he was part of now, and there was no useful distinction between those two facts. He had his own room at the boarding house on the east side of town. He was scrupulous about this, and so was she, because reputations in small towns in 1878 were practical concerns as much as moral ones, and Louise's position in Coldwater Creek had been hard-won and was not going to be carelessly risked. But there was not a person in town who did not know the shape of what was happening between them, because small towns see everything, and the general consensus among the people who had watched Louise fight for her deed and win it was quietly and firmly in favor. Mrs. Calloway was vocally in favor. She said so at the breakfast table with the regularity and directness of a woman who has made up her mind and sees no reason to be subtle about it. "You're going to propose," she told Alfred over coffee one October morning in the tone of a woman stating a fact that has already occurred. Alfred looked at her over his cup. "I'm working up to it." "Work faster," Mrs. Calloway said. "Winter's coming and that house needs 2 people in it." Alfred smiled into his coffee. "I've been thinking about the right moment." "The right moment," Mrs. Calloway said with the magnificent patience of someone who has lived 60 years, "is any moment in which she's there and you're there and you say the words. The rest is decoration." He had in fact been thinking about it for several weeks, not with uncertainty about what he wanted, which was entirely clear to him, but with the particular care of a man who has waited a long time for something real and wants to do right by it. He had written to his brother in Kansas, which was the kind of thing he had never done about a woman before, and received back a letter of such jubilant enthusiasm that it had made him laugh out loud in the street in front of Mrs. Calloway's mercantile, and then have to explain himself to 3 curious passers-by. He had also taken a trip to Amarillo, ostensibly for stage line business, and come back with a small box in his coat pocket that he had paid for with the money saved from 2 years of trail boss wages and 1 season of stage line management, and which he had immediately showed to Mrs. Calloway because he had nobody else to show it to, and Mrs. Calloway was the appropriate authority. Mrs. Calloway had looked at the ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet, dark red as autumn leaves, and said, "She'll say yes," with complete confidence. "You don't know that," Alfred said. Mrs. Calloway looked at him with the expression of a woman who knows exactly that. "Alfred Blackwell," she said, "I have watched that woman for 6 weeks before you arrived and 6 months since, and the only thing she has looked at with the same kind of attention she gives to that land is you. She'll say yes." He asked her on a late October evening, on the porch of her house, with the first real cold of the season in the air, and the stars overhead in the vast, brilliant Texas sky, the kind of stars that you only fully see when there are no other lights for 50 miles in any direction. He had not planned a speech, because speeches were not his particular strength, and Louise was the kind of person who would prefer the plain thing over the decorated one. He simply took out the small box and said her name and asked her. She looked at the ring for a long moment, and then she looked up at him, and her green eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears and not quite only happiness, but some complex and genuine mixture of everything the past year had held. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes." He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at her hand, and then at him, and he pulled her close and held her on that porch in the cold October air with the stars over the panhandle like a canopy, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt the solid reality of him, the particular warmth and steadiness that she had come to know over months as the most reliable thing in her immediate world. "Thomas bought this land so we could build a life on it," she said quietly. "I think he would be glad that it's becoming one." "I think so too," Alfred said, and meant it. They were married in December in the small Methodist church on the south side of Coldwater Creek, in a ceremony that Mrs. Calloway presided over in every meaningful way despite not being the minister. The church was more full than either of them had expected, because the town had followed the story of Louise's deed and Alfred's intervention and the summer of building, and the courtship conducted on the front porch of a house that the whole town had helped raise, and they were invested in the ending. Gus Patton sat in the front row with his wife and their 4 children, and looked like a man who was glad he had shown up on that first Saturday with his tools. Hobson from the county recorder's office came, which surprised both Alfred and Louise, and sat in the middle pews with the expression of a man who is making a quiet personal peace with several of his choices. Even Fellows, the clerk, attended, though he sat near the back and did not stay long after. Warren Prout did not come, which was neither surprising nor particularly regretted. The minister, a gentle young man named Reverend Coles, who had been in Coldwater Creek for less than a year and was still somewhat overwhelmed by it, led them through vows that Alfred and Louise had each read through carefully the day before and agreed were accurate to what they intended. When Alfred said, "I do," he said it in the same quiet, certain voice he used for everything, and when Louise said it, she looked directly at him and meant every syllable. Mrs. Calloway wept openly and without embarrassment, and produced a handkerchief from her sleeve with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had anticipated this necessity. The reception was held in the community hall, which had been decorated by approximately half the women of Coldwater Creek in a collaborative effort that resulted in something that was genuinely cheerful and only slightly chaotic. There was food in abundance. Mrs. Patton had organized a collection, and the table was crowded with pies and cold roasted chicken and cornbread and preserved fruit from the summer's abundance. Someone had acquired a fiddle player and a man who played squeezebox, and the music was lively and imperfect and exactly right. Alfred danced with Louise in the center of the hall while the fiddler played, and the community of Coldwater Creek stood in a ring around them, and she laughed at something he said in her ear, and he held her hand against his chest, and they moved together with the slightly improvised quality of 2 people who have not done this specific thing together before and find that it doesn't matter because the company is the point. "Are you happy?" he asked her, and it was a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. "Yes," she said, looking up at him. "I am genuinely, specifically, and in particular detail happy," he smiled. "Good. Are you?" "Louise," he said, "I have been a man without a particular place or purpose in it for 34 years. I am not going to undersell how happy I am tonight." She laughed again, and he turned her in the dance, and the fiddle played on. The winter was a good one, or as good as a panhandle winter could be, cold but not brutal, with enough snow to water the soil and not so much as to make life impossible. The house proved everything Thomas had designed it to be, warm from the fireplace, the kitchen holding heat from the stove, the bedroom on the east side catching the first of the morning light. It was a house that felt lived in from the first week, the way some houses do that are built with intention and moved into with purpose. Alfred's habits of early rising and late working fit naturally around Louise's own patterns. She was a morning person, efficient and organized in the first hours of the day, and he was the same, and they fell into the rhythms of shared life with a compatibility that felt less like luck than like the consequence of two people who had both been paying careful attention. He took the remount manager position permanently with the stage line, which gave them a reliable income while the land was being developed. Louise planted a winter kitchen garden in the protected area south of the house and wrote extensive letters to agricultural societies in Kansas and Missouri seeking advice on panhandle soil conditions. She also, somewhat to Alfred's amusement and considerable pride, began corresponding with a woman in Fort Worth who ran a small newspaper and had heard about the land dispute and wanted to write about it. "She wants to do a piece about women's property rights in Texas," Louise told him over supper one evening in January, the article she had received spread on the table between them. Alfred read it. "Good," he said. "You're not bothered by it." He looked up. "Why would I be?" "Some men," she said carefully, "would feel that their wife's public activities reflected on them. Some men," he said, "have confused being a husband with being an owner." He folded the letter and pushed it back across the table to her. "Write to her. Tell her what happened." She looked at him for a moment across the table in the evening lamplight, and the expression on her face was one he had come to recognize, a kind of quiet taking stock, as if she were registering a new coordinate on an internal map. "I keep expecting you to be less than you have been," she said. "That'll pass," he said. "I hope it doesn't," she said, and meant it as a compliment, which he took it as. The piece ran in the Fort Worth paper in March of 1879, and it was reprinted in two other Texas papers shortly after. And while it did not change the laws of Texas in any immediate sense, it said clearly and accurately what had happened to Louise Doyle, and how the mechanisms that were supposed to protect property rights had been applied with inconsistency that fell heavily along lines of gender. And it used the land office acknowledgement document and Hobson's own signature as evidence. And Hobson had to spend a week being very careful about how he responded to questions from people who had read it. The spring brought the full opening of the land. The cattle damage from the previous year had mostly healed. Louise had been right about the soil, which was resilient. And Alfred and Gus Patton and two young men Alfred hired from town broke the first fields in March and April. Louise oversaw the planting with the combination of textbook knowledge and instinctive agricultural sense that surprised everyone, including herself. And by May there were long green rows of winter wheat and sorghum coming up strong in the panhandle soil. The land looked like what Thomas had wanted it to be. Louise walked the rows in the early morning sometimes, alone, and Alfred watched her from the porch with his coffee and understood that those were private moments and kept them so. She was not the same woman she had been when Thomas died, and she knew it and did not mourn it. Grief had changed her but not broken her. What she had built in the year since his death, the deed she had defended, the house she had raised, the love she had found with Alfred, was not a replacement for what she had lost. It was something built on the same ground with different materials, toward a different but not lesser future. In the summer of 1879, she told Alfred she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning over breakfast, directly and clearly, watching his face with the particular attention of a woman who wants to see the real response before he has time to compose it. What she saw was not composed at all. It was immediate and unguarded and entirely genuine. His face going through something that started like surprise and resolved into a joy so complete and undefended that she felt it in her own chest like something unlocking. He got up from the table and came around to her side and held her face in both hands and said, "Louise," in the voice he used when words alone were insufficient, and she put her hands over his and said, "I know." He sat down next to her, and they sat at the kitchen table in the morning light with their cooling coffee and the window open to the summer air coming off the panhandle, and talked about names, about the room at the end of the hall that had been a storage room, about whether she would continue managing the farm during the pregnancy. Yes, she told him firmly, within reason. And he accepted this without argument because he understood that the correct response to Louise having an opinion about her own physical agency was not argument. "Boy or girl?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "What would you like?" She considered it honestly. "Either," she said. "Both in time if that's what comes." She looked at him. "You." "Either," he said immediately. Then after a pause, "A son first might be nice. For no reason I can fully explain." "That's not how it works," she said, and he laughed, and the morning went on around them. The child was indeed a boy, born in February of 1880 in the bedroom on the east side of the house in the second winter, delivered by the doctor who had arrived in Coldwater Creek the previous spring, and was proving to be a steady, competent presence. It was a long labor, and Louise was characteristically ferocious and focused throughout it. And Alfred spent the hours in the kitchen alternating between prayer and the mending of 2 saddle straps that he could have completed in 20 minutes, but made last the full duration because he needed something to do with his hands. When Dr. Yates came out of the bedroom and told him it was a boy and that Louise was fine, Alfred stood up very fast and then stood very still for a moment in the kitchen doorway with his hands at his sides. And Dr. Yates, who had seen this particular posture in many new fathers, gave him a moment before saying, "You can go in." The baby was red and small and objectionable looking in the way that all newborns are, and he was already expressing very strong opinions about his new surroundings, in a voice that suggested he would continue to have strong opinions for the foreseeable future. Louise was tired and luminous and propped against the pillows with the baby on her chest, and when Alfred came through the door, she looked up at him, with an expression that he later described to his brother in Kansas as the most overwhelming thing he had ever seen, which was saying something for a man who had once watched a thunderstorm cross the open prairie from horizon to horizon. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held him with the careful terror of a man who has never held something so small and so consequential, and the baby went abruptly quiet and looked up at him with the unfocused, ancient gaze of the very newly arrived. "Hello," Alfred said, in the same quiet, direct way he said everything. "Thomas Alfred," Louise said. She had told him weeks ago that she wanted to use Thomas's name, and he had understood immediately and agreed without hesitation. But Tom for ordinary use. Alfred looked at the baby, at Thomas Alfred Blackwell, who weighed just over 7 pounds and had a small, definitive nose that already looked like it intended to be as opinionated as the rest of him, and felt the particular ground shift of someone whose life has changed completely and irreversibly and exactly as it should. "Hello, Tom," he said. Tom regarded him with those dark, old-looking eyes and said nothing, which Alfred considered a reasonable and mature response from someone less than an hour old. Coldwater Creek had the good and bad qualities of most Texas towns in those years. It was growing, which meant opportunity, and it was rough-edged in ways that occasionally required navigation. There were injustices that Alfred and Louise both witnessed and could not always correct. The Mexican families who farmed the south edge of the county were regularly cheated on their contracts by the same land agents who had cheated Thomas, and the few black families who had come to Texas after the war were subjected to pressures and hostilities that the law was not reliably interested in addressing. Louise wrote about this too, in letters to the Fort Worth paper and in a longer essay that was eventually published in a Kansas City journal, and Alfred backed her in it because he had seen too much of the West's particular hypocrisies. The frontier celebrated for its freedom, while that freedom was applied with a selectivity that the celebrated mythology preferred to ignore. It was not a world that was going to be fixed by one woman's letters or one man's steady presence at a land office counter. But they both believed that small corrections compounded over time, and they made what corrections they could. Gus Patton became their nearest friend and neighbor, his farm bordering their parcel to the north, and his wife Clara became Louise's closest companion in those years, a woman of equal directness and considerable humor who had arrived in Texas from Ohio with opinions about everything, and had been refining them with the local material ever since. Clara and Louise were often found together on one porch or the other in the long summer evenings, talking with the focused engagement of two people who find each other genuinely interesting, while Alfred and Gus sat at a slight remove, discussing horses and fence repair with the agreeable intermittence of men who have been friends long enough to be comfortable with silence. Tom grew into a boy of serious expression and intense curiosity, who spent more time than his parents quite expected in the library that the town acquired in 1881, when a donation of books from a Chicago estate arrived on the stage and was housed in what had been the barbershop's back room. He had Alfred's steady manner and Louise's green eyes and Thomas Doyle's careful way with details, and the combination produced a child who was consistently underestimated by people who mistook quietness for absence. By the spring of 1882, Louise was expecting again, and this time the baby was a girl, born in September with her mother's dark hair and her father's dark eyes, and a disposition that was cheerful and decisive in equal measure from the beginning. They named her a leaner, called Nell, who arrived into a house that was by now fully itself warm and organized and well used, with books on shelves and maps on the walls and a kitchen garden that produced more than it was asked to, and a front porch where two people sat most evenings in the way of people who have found where they are supposed to be. Alfred sent a letter to his brother in New Mexico, who had two children of his own and a farm near Santa Fe, and described Nell in terms so affectionate that his brother wrote back saying he was glad to see that his younger brother had finally, as he put it, arrived somewhere. Alfred read the letter on the porch with Louise beside him and her feet tucked up under her in the way she had when she was comfortable, and he read her the relevant passage, and she said, "He's right," and he said, "I know," and that was the whole of the conversation and all that needed saying. The business of the farm improved steadily through the early 80s, as Louise's agricultural methods proved well adapted to the panhandle, and the combination of wheat and sorghum and a small herd of cattle purchased carefully, managed well, gave them a reliable and growing income. Alfred left the stage line work in 1883 and joined the farm fully, which doubled their productive capacity and gave him the kind of occupation that he had been working toward without quite knowing it, work that was his, in ground that was theirs, for a future that was being built one season at a time. Mrs. Calloway retired from the mercantile in 1882 and sold it to a young couple from Missouri, and took a room with Alfred and Louise for the last years of her life, which was an arrangement that suited everyone. She helped with the children and the household. The children adored her, and she sat on the front porch in her old age with the satisfaction of someone watching a thing she had helped to make become what it was always going to be. She died quietly in the winter of 1885, in the east-facing bedroom, and Louise held her hand at the end, and felt the particular grief of losing someone who had been kindness and resource and witness all at once. They buried her in the Coldwater Creek cemetery with a proper headstone, and the whole town came, as they had come to the wedding 7 years before, because a town pays attention to its own in the way that the country does not, and Mrs. Calloway had been attended to by Coldwater Creek with the love that was her due. Tom was 5 and Nell was 3 that winter, and they both stood at the graveside with the serious gravity of children who understand that something large has happened without fully understanding its dimensions. And afterward, Tom held his father's hand going back to the wagon, and Nell sat on her mother's lap and slept the sleep of the very young, which is the most merciful kind. By 1886, the house had been added to a room off the north side for the increasing needs of the library that Alfred and Louise had accumulated, and a proper wood-floored barn that replaced the initial lean-to, and a root cellar that was Louise's project of that spring, and that she was disproportionately proud of, as she had designed it herself, and it worked exactly as intended. Gerald Hatch, the land agent who had defrauded Thomas and sold the same parcel twice, was found and charged with fraud in 1884, in a different county where he had repeated the scheme several more times before a circuit judge finally caught up with him. Louise was asked to provide a deposition and did so, in writing, with the precise and documented clarity of someone who had been keeping the facts in order for 6 years. He was convicted and served 2 years in the county jail. She did not celebrate it exactly, but she wrote in her journal that evening that Thomas had paid for everything correctly, and that the record now said so clearly, and that this felt like a completion. The land itself continued to become what Thomas had sketched in that small notebook. The garden north of the draw, the house with its east-facing rooms, the fields in their proper rotations, the low fence line along the road that Alfred built one autumn with Gus Patton and Tom helping in the ways that a 7-year-old can help, which are numerous and occasionally counterproductive and entirely essential. It was the kind of land that had been cared for, and it showed in the way that things that are cared for do, not showily, but with a rightness, a particular quality of belonging to itself and to the people who worked it. Alfred in those years settled into himself in the way that some men do when they find the right ground. He became more fully himself, the contained quality of his nature revealing itself not as reserve but as depth, as the stillness at the center of a life that was actively and completely lived. He was a good father in the specific ways that matter: present, consistent, attentive without being overbearing, willing to be corrected by his children in the small areas where children are right and adults have stopped paying attention. Tom brought him a new perspective on patience on a daily basis. Nell brought him a new perspective on determination. Louise watched him with her land and her children and the daily business of their shared life with the same assessing attention she had brought to everything from the beginning, and what she found, season after season and year after year, was not what she had expected from permanence, not the settling of dust or the quieting of feeling, but something more like the opposite, a deepening. The way that understanding someone better does not reduce them but expands them, so that the person you know in the 7th year is larger and more real than the person you knew in the 1st, and the 8th year adds to that, and the 9th. She told him this one evening in the spring of 1887, on the porch that had been the site of their first kiss and the regular home of their evenings for nearly a decade, with the Panhandle sunset doing its extravagant best above the long grass and the stars beginning to show at the margins of the sky. "You're better to know than you were at the beginning," she said. He looked at her, and the lines around his eyes were deeper now than they had been in the land office in 1878, and there was gray beginning at his temples, and he was in every physical sense more worn by time, and she found him, entirely and without effort or decision, more beautiful than he had been the morning she first saw him. "So are you," he said. "I've become considerably more opinionated," she said. "I know," he said. "I like it." She leaned against him, which she did in the evenings with the comfortable ease of someone resting against something reliably solid, and he put his arm around her with the same ease, and they sat in the last of the daylight and watched the Texas sky close over into evening. Tom came out of the house behind them and stood in the doorway, and said that Nell had gotten into the root cellar and couldn't get the door open from the inside, which was the kind of news that required immediate parental attention and was also somewhat funny. And Alfred went to deal with it, and Louise put her face in her hands and tried not to laugh and failed. Nell emerged from the root cellar indignant but unharmed, with a jar of preserved peaches that she had apparently decided was worth the entrapment, and she presented it at the supper table with the triumphant air of someone who has completed a successful expedition. And the family ate supper with the sounds of children and the last of the evening light through the kitchen window. And the house was warm and full, and precisely everything it was supposed to be. The deed that nobody would honor sat in the small cedar box on the bedroom dresser, alongside Thomas Doyle's notebook of sketches and the county recorder's acknowledgment letter, and the marriage certificate of Louise Doyle and Alfred Blackwell, dated December 1878, and one of Mrs. Calloway's handkerchiefs that Louise had kept because some things you keep not because they are useful, but because they carry a weight of meaning that deserves a place to rest. Everything that had been built on those 200 acres, every season of it, every early morning and hard winter and spectacular panhandle sunset, was rooted in that folded document, in Thomas's careful handwriting on the purchase line, in the notary's stamp from Amarillo, in the date that predated Warren Prute's cattle by 7 weeks and Gerald Hatch's fraud by everything. Alfred had read it in the morning light of the Coldwater Creek land office and said it looked good to him, and it had been, from that moment forward, the beginning of everything. The land was real and the deed was valid, and the house stood exactly where it had been sketched in a small notebook by a careful man who loved his wife and wanted to build her something worthy of that love. And what had been built on it was worthy and then some. It was a life, full and various and deeply rooted, and it was theirs, and it was good. In the long, settled happiness of the years that followed, when Coldwater Creek grew and the railroad came closer, and Tom grew into a serious young man who went to read law in Austin, and Nell became a young woman of fierce opinions and considerable capability, who reminded people of her mother in ways that Alfred considered with immense and uncomplicated pride. And when the evenings on the porch stretched out across the seasons with all the accumulation of a shared history that has been built by hand from the ground up, in all of that, Alfred Blackwell remained the man who had walked through a door into a land office on a spring morning in 1878 and read 4 words on a stranger's deed and said exactly what he saw. It looked good to him. It still did. It always would.